That was the sounds of the Upper West Side as every evening at 7 p.m., neighbors cheer on our amazing medical and essential workers who are caring for our fellow citizens in this era of COVID-19. You're tuned to Bar Crawl Radio. Becky and I are not recording in neighborhood bars right now, but we are continuing to bring you interesting conversations with citizens doing important work. Recently, a dear friend sent me her son's new book about his work in the field of social justice in poor and black communities in the Chicago area and elsewhere. At the end of Seeds of Justice, Alex Tyndall Wiesendonger writes, "We can transform our churches, and our churches can transform the world." Today, we'll be talking with Alex and two other Christian leaders working for social justice. And this BCR episode was co-produced by Alina Larson. All right, with that bit of an intro, here we go.
That was Wade Ripka's Eastern Blockheads Band, who will return to Barbez in Brooklyn as soon as we conquer COVID-19. With us today are Alex Tyndall Wiesendonger. He has worked with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and lived in a Catholic worker community. Alex was the former director of the Illinois Community Renewal Society and associate director of the Tennessee Coalition to Abolish State Killing. Also with us is Peter Cook. He is the executive director of the New York State Council of Churches. He was senior minister at the First Congregational Church in Burlington, Vermont, and the Plymouth Church in Framingham, Massachusetts, and pastor of St. John's United Church of Christ in Waukegan, Illinois. Brian Kramer's experience of tutoring high school students in 2011 led in 2013 to working with homeless men at the Doe Fund. Brian is now the co-leader of the Justice Team of the Fourth Universalist Society of New York. Okay, welcome all. Each of you have a totally different and yet very similar story of how you got into the work of social justice within the structure of the church. Can we share those beginnings?
I guess I grew up in a family that was very social justice oriented. It was Berkeley, California in the 60s and 70s. My father was head of the redevelopment agency in Berkeley, and my mother worked as a Christian educator at the church there and really helped integrate the first preschool in Berkeley in the 60s and 70s. So it's been a part of the family ethos a long time. After seminary, my first church was in Waukegan, Illinois, St. John's United Church of Christ. Working class community. Waukegan was a town that really was left behind with factories closing, community that really struggled. You know, we really delved deeply into questions around housing and homelessness. And we decided about halfway through my ministry that we would build an affordable housing development for seniors and people with disabilities. And we did succeed in doing that, a 22-unit development.
So this was sort of your family business that you got into.
Yeah.
Was it always assumed that you would that you would become part of the clergy? I mean, was that always your dream?
No, I fought it for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and I probably did everything I could to avoid the church as much as possible. I was very interested in social movements and history and justice kinds of issues, but really was not connecting that a whole lot to the church. But there was a point at which I really felt that the parish church, to use Robert Bella's image, really embraced the whole of life. At its best, really was the vehicle to engage a community with God at center, right, and where we work on building community. And so I went through a bit of a transformation after fighting this a long time and found myself going to seminary.
And Alex, I know you have a very different beginning on the road that you took than Peter's. I known your mother for a long, long time. In fact, she sent me your book, and I was so interested in it. I knew we had to talk about this. How did you get into social justice movement and the church involved in social justice?
Absolutely. So I grew up on the other side of the country from Peter, right here, in New York City, in Harlem in the 80s. And for folks who are here, right, and can remember that time, Harlem was a community that was really struggling, really oppressed, almost all kind of black and brown, low-income families. And I got sort of tricked very early by the world into seeing and understanding injustice. So for me, it was first grade or kindergarten, because when you take standardized tests as a 5-year-old, you're not testing intelligence, right? You're testing your social background, your social economic status, what books are your parents reading to you. So I was able to test, right, as quote unquote gifted. So I went downtown to a fancy school, fancy gifted school. And I walk into the classroom and immediately notice the kids in this class don't look anything like my friends on the playground in my neighborhood. And, after a few minutes, you can figure out, but they're not smarter here than my friends. What's going on? And you get invited over to their houses, and their houses are way different, right, than my apartment. Once you move out of New York, you realize that they're not actually big. They're still small, but for New York, these are big apartments. And then you invite your friends over for a play date, and their parents say, like, oh, no, they can't come there, right? They can't come up to that neighborhood. And so kind of very early, I was able to watch as I get put on this path that's for middle-income, upper-income white kids, right? Go to a good high school, go to college, go to law school, go get a business degree, right? Whatever those things are. And it's all set up for me. That's what everyone on this path is doing. And my friends are going to this school that looks totally different than the school I went to, that has totally different resources. They're getting, arrested, they're getting pushed out, and they're on this path, right, to be pushed out of school, to get harassed, to end up in jail, right, to end up dead. These are the plans. And it was set up starting when we were 5 years old. So that, kind of forced me to see that this wasn't about individuals. This was about the structures that our society sets up and that we're all a part of, whether we're actively doing it or not. And then, for me, I was very blessed to grow up in what is becoming more and more an anachronism, but sort of a really progressive Catholic church that made those connections for me very quickly, saying like, actually, this crazy, itinerant, brown-skinned Palestinian that we all worship was a social revolutionary. And so it was very easy for me to connect the struggles that was happening in my community with the struggles that we were reading about in the Bible. And knowing that that was my spiritual home, but also knowing that the church is something really special. And I think we can dig into this more of why the church should and needs to be at the center of any social movement. And
we will. And I urge people, if you haven't seen it yet, Seeds of Justice, and get more of that story of Alex's beginning in his road towards the church and social justice. Brian, what is your story?
I came at this from, the opposite side of religion, as well as the opposite side of social justice. I grew up a self-described white guy from New Jersey. Religion, my parents mixed religion, so I never really bought into either one of them. I guess when I wasn't doing well in college, and a friend of my mother's from her church helped me out and kind of, sat me down and gave me an introduction to a company, a job, and I realized how much somebody giving you a hand up can help. Did well, went on from there and realized how important a job was and how satisfying it could be, and started volunteering. And first started tutoring, then the Doe Fund with homeless men and helping them get jobs and job placement. It was, I guess, a lot of people midlife with parents, discovered religion. And someone introduced me to ethical culture and the Unitarian religion. That really resonated with me because it was people that were focused on doing good. There was a lot of freedom in what you believed. It was really eye-opening. The Doe Fund was thoroughly eye-opening to see the other side, to realize, like, There's, for example, criminal justice. There's really two worlds of criminal justice. There was criminal justice that, the police are your friend, and what a lot of these guys at the Doe Fund went through. The more I learned, the more I realized that there was a lot of work to be done. And once I found Fourth Universalist, I found kindred spirits there. And now I'm co-lead of the justice team. So we work on social justice, and we work on trying to get the congregation to go along with us. So it's been kind of a strange journey, but it's been a good one.
Peter, you're the head of the New York State Council of Churches. Tell us about what that organization is, its history, and maybe a little bit about its mission.
The New York State Council of Churches had its beginnings in the late 19th century as the New York Sunday School Association. And that was a time when Sunday school was really about offering literacy to people. I mean, it didn't look anything like what Sunday school might look like now. I think it was probably a much more socially engaged exercise. But we really were born out of the social gospel movement, which really said that, preaching the gospel is not just about one's personal salvation, but about, sanctifying a community, the world, about, lifting up the poor and the forgotten and the disenfranchised. So that's kind of our early history. At present, we're comprised of about 7,000 Protestant congregations across the state of New York. And we work really in 3 or 4 areas. One is really trying to influence social policy and legislation, which we think is going to lift up the poor and the disenfranchised and the forgotten. And so we just weigh in on a whole bunch of things, from the environment to healthcare to economic inequality to access to housing. COVID crisis is just posed immense public policy challenges for us. So we try to educate our congregations about these issues so that they can use these tools to act in the public square.
Brian, let's jump to you. The Fourth Universalist Society of New York. Briefly, what is that organization? Then the Justice Team. I'd like to hear about that because I know you helped develop that. And what are their goals?
Yeah, so it was started when I joined the church. It's a group under the head minister that really tries to bring social justice to the congregation and help get them engaged. I guess I look at it as we're finders and facilitators. We are involved in finding opportunities that congregants can take part in, and then we really make it easy for them. I kind of figure it's like a friend that might know all the good restaurants, and then he organizes a trip to the restaurant. That's kind of what we do. We look like maybe there's a rally, maybe there's a meeting at town hall, a letter signing. So part of it's education, and then once we find something, we'll make it easy. We'll set up, we'll have the letters that people can sign, and we'll have the meeting, and we'll get the group together. So that's really what we do in a nutshell.
And finally, Alex, I don't think you are involved with them anymore, but the Community Renewal Society in Chicago, you were headed up for quite a number of years. So maybe you can talk about that organization.
Yeah, I'd be thrilled to. So the Community Renewal Society is a 100, maybe 40-year-old organization now in Chicago. I was the director of organizing there under the leadership of the Reverend Dr. Calvin Morris, who came out of, worked on Dr. King's staff, was Jesse Jackson's number 2 in founding Rainbow Push, and a real icon of the social justice movement and a mentor to me. CRS was a network of over 100 congregations by the time we were done across the Chicago metro area, organizing themselves to take really powerful action around racial and economic justice issues. And so working with the ministries like Bryant, right? Like going in and working with the Bryans and his teams in every congregation, from Unitarian to Baptist to Catholic to everywhere in between, trying to exert the power of the church to really move changes in public policy and practices.
Can you think of one particular activity that the CRS that you were involved with that you were very proud of?
Wow, there are a lot, but I think I would identify two things, if it's okay. So the first was the creation and launch of something called the FORCE Project, which stood for Fighting to Overcome Records and Create Equality. So it was an organization organizing and run by people with criminal records, who were then organizing other people with records around the issues that were really impacting their ability to re-enter their communities and live their lives. And that network of people with records passed a bunch of bills around the state to remove systemic barriers to reentry, things like you couldn't get certain professional licenses if you had a criminal record. You couldn't seal your record. It sits on there forever. So expanding the sealing of records, removing barriers to employment was a huge thing. And we saw hundreds of people with records take action for themselves. The second was a network of churches kind of taking control of the issues of violence that they were facing, and launching something called the Reclaim Campaign, which basically called to move people out of the Cook County Jail and invest money in neighborhood-based peace hubs. And to do that, we had to launch a four-pronged effort, because one of the problems with the criminal justice system, which is not that different here, is that it's a multi-headed monster, and no one person is running everything. So you had the president of Cook County, who's in charge of the county budget. You had the sheriff, who's in charge of the jail. You had the state's attorney, who's sending people to the jail, right? We had to network and build a campaign that moved and impacted all of those people to do a set of things. But there's now a restorative justice court in my old home neighborhood of North Lawndale. And then I'm going to lie. The third thing I think is we created a culture with our public assemblies, particularly on Martin Luther King Day, when you'd see thousands of church members come and demand and drag their elected officials down to the front of the church and insist that those officials give a yes-no commitment to all of the issues that the congregations themselves had come up on and demand. And it became kind of this ritual that elected officials sort of knew they had to come because there were too many churches in their district that would make their lives like a living hell if they didn't. And became this really kind of powerful annual moment where you'd see elected officials the first time they came just freaking out and like, you know, terrified and angry, and then learning that, oh, if I behave, this actually goes well, and becoming kind of like looking forward to it moments of, yeah, this is the time I get held accountable, but it's in a really good way, because then when I'm trying to move these bills, I've got churches all around the state who go make other people's lives hell for me, and I like that. So I want to stay on their good side, and I'll be there.
Right.
So you're all working for positive social change. Clearly, our country has a far way to go to gain social equity for all of our citizens. How is this an appropriate work for the church?
Well, let me just
go ahead,
start with a nice classic Reformed theological approach here. John Calvin said that we receive the grace of God, but in response to the grace that we receive, we are called to build the city of God, to build a holy and a just society. What is a holy and just society, of course, is somewhat open to debate, and whether you really discern correctly the grace of God is also open to debate sometimes. But really, that personal kind of religion, which is disconnected from the world around you, really is has a very tenuous theological foundation. Unfortunately, what we have sometimes in churches is that they think that this is just kind of a personal thing, and to not get involved in things like politics, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Because if you choose not to be involved in politics, you are taking a political position. So that's an impossibility. So it's better to embrace the fact that everything in the church is political in its most positive sense. And you're there to help each person that you encounter in your church and your community to see that they are deserving of God's grace, that they are children of God, and that they need to be treated as such. And that is about our interpersonal actions, but it's also about making structural and societal changes.
But Alex, not everyone would in a congregation would agree with that. That must be a struggle. So how do you explain to them that this is the church's activity? This isn't appropriate. This is appropriate.
Yeah, I think it's beyond appropriate. It's required and necessary. I think that the big lie, and Peter referred to this, the big lie we've been told is that churches aren't supposed to be political. And in fact, you can't open the Bible and not find an example of the church being political, right? If you go all the way back to the Old Testament, Moses is committing political acts, right? Changing the fundamental social structure of Egypt, right? Taking a people from bondage into freedom is a political action. It has nothing to do with praying and going to heaven. That's just not what happened. Very similarly, Jesus' message is deeply and overtly political in every moment, which is why Jesus is crucified, right? A lot of these things we forget today, but crucifixion wasn't for misbehavior. Crucifixion was for opposing the Roman state. It was only for enemies of the state, which you only get for being political, right? Every part of our theology should point us toward taking action. But I think that we have to go a little deeper, and in engaging people and engaging churches, sort of the credo that I've developed working with folks is we should stop talking at people about our theology, having just spewed at you all about my theology, and really start talking to people and with people about their own experience and what's happening in their own lives, and unpacking some of these issues, and especially unpacking what does it mean for you that we have a school system that is based totally on how much money your parents make and where you live, right? And what does that mean, and how does that reflect, and do you think God is happy with that? And as we get into those moments and build those relationships, that's how we move people to action. So I guess I'd say first, this lie that we aren't supposed to be political is dangerous. And the folks who benefit from it are the people who don't want most of us to be engaged. And then I'd second say that it's on us then to go out and have real, authentic conversations throughout our churches and engage people based in their real hearts and their guts. So a lot of us like to spend a lot of time up in our heads, and the more we can get people to respond from their souls, I think we move them to action.
Right, from where they live.
So
Exactly.
Brian, you where do you stand on this idea of politics in the religion? I mean, you came to religion as an adult, you say.
So I guess the Unitarian religion was just very, very different than how I was raised. It's really baked right into the religion, and there's 7 principles that they're guides on how Unitarians should be in the world. And for example, the 5th principle is the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregation and society at large. So there you have it. Right now we're doing a big get out the vote drive, and we're working on using phone calls and postcards to help register people in suppressed states. So, that's right there. Based on that, we attract a certain activist crowd and people who really believe in social justice and want a religion that's infused with social justice.
Yet I'm hearing from all three of you that religion, the church, Christianity, and I would bring in Judaism similarly, is really political. I mean, there's religious, the belief, the raising of the spirit, but that it cannot be separated from the political. And yet the way our system is set up, the church is separated from the state. It's separated at a financial basis and at a legal basis. And so, how do you bring those two things together when what you're doing is both religious and socially relevant and political?
Yeah, I think that's one of the other big misconceptions and misunderstandings, right? This idea of that separation of church and state means that the church can't stake out positions and advocate for political issues is false. And in fact, even the IRS will tell you that, right? That a church is absolutely allowed to do what's called citizen lobbying, to do what Brian is just referring to of get out the vote. The distinction on a legal basis is that we shouldn't become partisan. And I think for a lot of us, one of the reasons that for many years, sort of people on the progressive end of the spectrum moved away from the church is because we saw the church kind of abused and becoming just a sort of an operational arm of the Republican Party.
So that's,
which is really bad for the church.
Are there issues that are improper to pursue with a congregation? Is it inappropriate for a church leader to endorse a political candidate?
The answer is yes, it is. Although, there used to be a time in New England where the preacher gave what was called the election sermon. That was way back in the day, and people would gather, and I'm not sure that it quite came to an endorsement, but it's pretty darn close. It's really about holding up what are the ideals that we want anyone running for elected office to aspire to, and then let people evaluate that accordingly. Trust their intelligence. The other thing I would just say is, in terms of preaching, from a political perspective in the pulpit, pastors are not there as, marketers trying to, push one point of view and to win everybody over to that view. They're there to provoke and to get people to think and to stir their conscience, and then to act based on what they heard coming out of their own wrestling.
You have a parishioner come to you and say, Reverend, I like what Trump is doing. I think he's doing a great job. I'm worried about this and that he is. But what is your personal opinion? Do you give that?
It always depends on the context. Who I'm talking to. I mean, it might be if you got a pretty strong Trump supporter, that you respond by asking questions or saying things like, well, that's one way to look at it. Have you considered thinking about it this way? Mm-hmm. Or trying to find out what that person's really struggling with, in their own lives, and how it is that they came to this point of view. And you just sort of proceed from there. It's difficult. It's hard. Sometimes you just gotta say what you think about a president or a candidate. But I think the point here is, how do you engage a person in a relationship? There's reasons that people voted for Donald Trump, and they're not all crazy. They feel a lot of times like the establishment, Washington, just didn't speak to their needs anymore, and the sense of despair that government really can't deliver, and they like sort of the bombastic, iconoclastic approach of Trump that they, sort of perceive as, sticking it to the establishment, but trying to get under that and sort of understand where people are coming from, I think, is important.
Yeah.
So, Brian, what about you?
One of the sub-teams that in the Justice team is the democracy group. And part of that is expanding democracy out to the general public. But the other part of it is using our democratic system to further the belief we have in certain issues. So it's building relationships with our representatives. It's letter writing campaigns to our representatives. It's anything we can do to bring people around to, our beliefs. So, but it's issue based.
What if there's a large donor at your church that disagrees with the work that you're doing? Have you come up against that? How do you handle it?
That's hard. I think you do the best you can with good pastoral care and to stay connected with people and to make them feel as though you care about them as a human being, and that you're not pastoring to people in a really partial way, but to really give people that attention. But even with all of that, it a lot of times doesn't work, and some people just are going to have to leave, and they're going to have to take their money with them. And if you try to pander too much, then you start hurting other people in the church. And frankly, you kind of lose your integrity, and I think even that wealthy donor would see that. So I think to be as honest as you can and as caring as you can, but there's only so much you can do, and you can't sell out your integrity in the process. And sometimes people on their journey, they need to leave and go someplace else. And to be able to do that gracefully with them and honorably with them, I think is difficult. But don't pander. That would be my advice.
And Alex, you said you had a story. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, I think Peter's right. I think there's sort of two big pieces that I draw, but my first is a story of a set of churches that we were working with, and there's this Koch brother funded fake think tank in Illinois called the Illinois Policy Institute that has a ton of money to put out, attack public services, attack taxes are the worst, slash everything, slash public schools, and they do a lot of that. And so we marched and held a prayer vigil to bring a spirit of truth to the Illinois Policy Institute. The executive director of the Illinois Policy Institute was an active and incredibly large donor of one of our bigger, more wealthy churches, and responded, as you would imagine, kind of very negatively. And I was so proud of how well trained that pastor was, because he sent this email that was clearly like he expected the response of the pastor to be like, "Oh, we should never have been political. I'm so sorry. We'll never do that again." And instead, because the pastor had been trained in relational organizing, the pastor said, "Well, look, I understand how you feel. Our church came to this issue through a process where we talked to everyone, and we had a deliberative process, listening to our neighbors, listening to our congregation. I'd love to sit down with you and talk about that and talk about how we got there." In the end, the person didn't want to have the conversation, but actively stayed in the church, right? He sort of thought that the church would back down immediately, but he stayed in the church and continued to be an active member. He never came to, a march on his own organization, but he wasn't going to do that anyway. And I think what that illustrates is that there is this fear and this belief, even in those of us doing this work, that if we do political work, it will be divisive within our congregation. But my experience is, if we come at it the right way, it's actually a thing that energizes and engages our congregation. And it can bring people together if we start not from, I'm up here to tell you about criminal justice reform or whatever the issues we care about. But if we start by, we know that our love has to be about everything and understanding what's important, we're going to go talk to everyone in our church through a process to identify issues and take action. It's very unifying. with that said, there are some people who won't buy into that. And the last thing we used to train clergy in and still do is that you choose who you lose. And you need to understand that if you keep those people who want to spew, something racist or want to shoot down everything that, sounds political, you can do that. But you can't then ask, why aren't there young people in our church? Because you've decided to build a church that people don't want to be a part of, right? Because they know you won't stand on the issues that affect them Monday through Saturday. So why should I come to your church on Sunday? And so I think that this is a crucial part of re-engaging, unchurched people. And the generation I'm like at the very old end of, when I used to do this work, I got asked a lot, how do we get more young people like you in the church? No one asks me that anymore.
You seem pretty young there, Alex.
I appreciate that. But, this is the least church generation in American history. And it's not because people don't want to be connected to things, and it's not because they don't want to believe in God. It's because they don't believe in the church. And it's because they don't see the church standing up for its own values. So you can grow your church when you take this seriously.
When we're talking here, the communities that we're talking about is the community of the poor, the community of the depressed, financially depressed, but also emotionally depressed, and the black community, which you write about.
Which is one and the same, actually.
Which is in this country is mostly the same. You've just been talking, Alex, and I think all of you have been referring to it, is you don't pick the issue, you let the congregation pick the issue by listening. And in your book, Seeds of Justice, you emphasize that and how you do that. But here's the question that I have, is that you have an overview, the three of you, about how the system works, because you work with the system, you work with the politicians, you work with the bureaucrats in order to make change. Your congregation doesn't necessarily have that overview. And so it's listening, but it must also be guiding that listening. It's not just all listening. It's got to be more kind of like, we can do that, we can't do that. Brian, I see you shaking your head. You want to say something about that?
We do a good amount of education. I always say education is the root of activism. For example, we're doing this big postcard writing drive to re-register voters down in voter-suppressed states. That started with the screening of a half-an-hour documentary, Suppress the Fight to Vote. People, we had a screening in our congregation. People watched it. A lot of them were like, how can this be in America? How can this possibly be happening? And once they saw the video, they said, this has got to change. They were all fired up. What can we do to change this? And then we can step in and say, well, funny you asked. We're looking to organize this postcard writing. And, we had 40 people, 50 people for a couple of these parties pre-corona. And now we've ramped up again, and people are writing postcards from home, and we're adding, more and more people. So that's a big part. We screened a movie. I first got involved with Fourth Universalist, screening Rikers in American jail. And again, people saw that and said, wow, that's awful. I did not know that existed, that those were the conditions. And, that was a little more problematic, finding things people could do to become engaged. But they certainly, it opened a lot of eyes. So,
Peter, are you involved with that? Everyone out there, the churches that belong to us, here's an idea that we should be looking at.
We try to really work through a lot of movements and information and try to organize it in ways so that it's intelligible to people so that they can act. I think that's, so we try to really listen in on a lot of conversations in the social justice realm. The only way I know how to listen in is to show up. And it's even better when people of faith show up. What's the adage? 80% of ministries showing up. And a lot of times social justice work, to be quite frank, for churches, it's kind of like an echo chamber. They talk to each other, or they kind of build up their denomination to say, look at what we're doing. And that's not terribly impressive to me. It's much more impressive when I see people of faith, pastors, and lay folks showing up and building relationships with people who may never darken the door of your church. It's going into African American communities. It's showing up at the the prayer breakfast of the African American pastors meeting on whatever day. And then out of these experiences, people start to get a fire, or a fire starts, something lights in them. I'll give you an example. I had a retired software engineer in my church in Massachusetts who was kind of casting around. So I said, hey, Len, I see that they're helping homeless people that they put up in these hotels. Would you just come with me and let's learn about this together? And then he started to do food deliveries, and it just so affected him and the relationships he built that he decided to set up a nonprofit to give first and last month's rent to people who are trying to get into their apartments.
Wow.
Wow.
But it didn't come through studying the issue, or it came through a very personal encounter. To say one other thing, I sometimes like to joke that, United Methodists in the 19th century, lay people at that time, they were much more interested in things like what's going on with slavery, what's going on with prohibition. My family's falling apart because of alcohol. A lot of times it was women, who really just were on fire to sanctify the world, their community. And, indeed you have the United Methodist Women's Building, which is right at the edge of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., which was put there really to irritate Congress, really, So I think that's a nice old historic image that we should hold on to, rather than people sitting around and quibbling about how to have a better coffee hour.
There's a basic cause to these issues. I mean, there are causes to any problem. My wonder is how much of your time is looking at the cause of the problem. Now, Alex, in your book, I'm going to name it again, Seeds of Justice, because I want everyone to read it. You talk about the babies upriver that are floating down and they're dead, and all these babies. But you then say, well, we need to look upriver to see what the cause is. How much of your time is spent not just in activating people to do something, but to activate them to actually create effective change, because you're really going after the cause of that problem?
Yeah, I hope all of our activity and energy is there, right? We should be really focused on how do we identify what's really creating trouble and injustice, and how do we effectively change it. And I think that I love what, Brian, what you said a minute ago about every piece of education has to be connected to action, right? I think that we often think we'll just educate people and the world will get better. But no, it's taking that, understanding what's happening in people's lives, helping them come to an understanding of what's creating that situation. And then how do we actually move and change it? And I think there's a couple real key pieces. And another, we already talked about sort of my first favorite dirty word in church, which is political, right? You're not supposed to say that. And the second is the word power. That all of these, the fundamental issue is how much power is held by so few people, and how we have to build a different kind of power to change that. And that's what I think the work of organizations like the ones we're talking with and organizers is. How do we build enough power, bring people together to actually force systems to change? And the great thing when you focus about building power is that it doesn't sit in just one issue, right? When you build power, it's like building your muscles. And then whether it's football or basketball, you've got some basic groundwork to build. And so when we really focus on how do we build enough power to change these systems that are destroying people, and how do we effectively build a strategy that then utilizes that power, I think that's how we win. And just to close on a quote, because it's not just me, Dr. King, quoting Reinhold Niebuhr, said that power without love is tyranny, but love without power is anemic sentimentality. And so if we don't want our love to be just a Hallmark card, we have to get serious about that call to build power.
Thank you very much. This is just a quick announcement. This is Bar Crawl Radio. We're talking about social justice and working for social justice within the American churches with Alex Tyndall Wiesendanger. I'm not going to get that right. Alex Tyndall Wiesendanger, Reverend Peter Cook, and Brian Kramer. We're going to get now into a little bit of, I think, maybe contentious. I mean, we're talking about, problems and causes of problems. In some instances, the church itself, the organized church, is part of the problem that we're facing. How much do you get involved with that? I hear silence.
So there's a couple places. It's a very big question, which is why I think you're hearing silence. But I think you're right. And the church is the problem in a couple ways. One, there are churches that are sort of actively agents of perpetuating injustice, right? We see that a lot in a really upsetting way. But I go more and more to the real problem is the vast majority of churches that think they can sit on the sidelines. To go back to the point Peter made earlier, which is an impossibility, right? Howard Zinn said you can't be neutral on a moving train, and I think that's right. And that the biggest problem, or in Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, that the problem is less the Ku Klux Klaner than the white moderate, was his analysis there. That the fact that so many of us aren't acting at all is, to me, where the real issue is. So I personally tend to not try to move a church that is convinced that, Jesus is a rich white guy who loves capitalism and hates brown people, than I do on getting the 50 churches that aren't taking action at all in the public sphere to, own their own beliefs and take action on them.
Okay. Peter, do you have a point of view on this? Or?
I think that church, by definition, is a pretty screwed up place from the beginning. I mean, it was founded by, this guy named Peter. They called him the Rock, right? Well, he was the guy who, sold Jesus down the river. And yet, here we go. We're building a church based on this very imperfect person. So, I think what we're called to do as pastors is to help churches admit their frailty and their brokenness and their imperfection, and to somehow find that God's grace works through that in the middle of it all. And, even some of the crazy things that churches do that frustrate us, there's reasons that they're there, that they do it that way. And you have to sort of be patient with that and try to hold people's hands and look for the spots of transformation. But, even that, their churches are just capable of great evil, who destroy their pastors, who, in spite of everything you do to, be caring and loving and so on, I think sometimes they're just, I don't really believe in the devil, but they're demonic forces that really can rip a church apart. And that's been true from the beginning. So but I guess my only other point would be, so what institution isn't frail and isn't profoundly broken? And sometimes people say, well, the church is kind of an anachronism. Well, of course it is. All institutions are to a certain degree. But the point is, how do you work with that broken vessel to do the ministry that God's called you to do?
Good answer.
How far
I like
does
that.
your resistance go? Is nonviolent, peaceful resistance with the possibility of rest part of your activity or mission? We've been working and talking with the members of the Kings Bay Plowshares, the
Kings Bay
Catholic
Plowshares
workers,
7 against atomic
and
warfare.
the Witness Against Torture, and they within their organization, or within their groups, within their actions, decide someone will say, yes, I'll be arrested for this. What about you all?
Yeah, and Alex, you've been part of the Catholic worker community. I mean, you understand Dorothy Day and Peter Morin and what they went through. So where is that? Where is political activism and arrest? Are you involved with that kind of activity?
Yeah, I've been arrested many times. I stopped counting because I realized it was sort of a spiritual masturbation of like, look, I've been arrested X times. I must be such a good activist. So I think that there's no doubt, like, Christianity worships a God who was arrested for civil disobedience, right? Like, that's just a fact. And so that's clearly something that is there. I think that there is a pretty clear call that whatever we do be nonviolent in the way we do it. I think that the tactic really should be driven out of a strategy of what do you think will create change. I've moved away just personally myself from kind of symbolic arrest. But when you think about things, civil disobedience movements, but that's not because I think it's wrong. It's just because I'm not sure it's strategically the strongest. But the kind of civil disobedience that actually shuts stuff down, right? When you think about the 60s and why sit-ins were so valuable, right? They actually shut down the ability for downtown businesses to run. And that's, I think, vital. But I think that what we shouldn't do is take a tactic divorced from a strategy. There are some campaigns, some decision makers who will be very affected by civil disobedience. There are others who will not. And I think we don't just sort of apply, here's the cookie cutter campaign approach, no matter what we're doing. We take a look at what do we have to do? What do we need to change here? Who are the decision makers that need to be moved? And then what are the tactics that demonstrate enough power to move them?
And sometimes arrest is needed for that.
Sure, if it's valuable. We had a wonderful arrest at in the mayor's office, where we were doing an Ash Wednesday service of putting ashes at City Hall because of the murder of African Americans by the Chicago Police Department.
Beautiful.
And it is very valuable and wonderful. But I think also we should acknowledge whenever we talk about things like arrest, and I think this is important for us to say here, it's one thing for American citizen white men to talk about being arrested. It's a totally different thing for people of color, people who are undocumented, people who already have a criminal record. It's a very, very different and vastly more risky tactic for those folks, right? And I think that we should acknowledge that if we need to be really honest about that and acknowledge that. And I think there's a role for those of us who it's less risky for to put our bodies between systems and more vulnerable people. But I think we should also be clear that when we talk about that kind of tactic, it's two completely different conversations.
One of the things I found very interesting about your book, Alex, was I'm not a believer of Jesus, I'm Jewish, but your approach to his teachings and his approach to activism through what he did was most enticing as a political leader to make change. So I really appreciated that, and I want to thank you for that and recommend people to take a look at that, Alex's analysis of Jesus' actions. We're in a very serious moment right now in this country, in the world, with COVID-19 pandemic. I thought maybe we can focus in on particular actions that the activist church, what can we do now? Peter, I was reading a statement that you made recently that the church advocates for a just local, state, and national housing policy and financing. Maybe in this COVID-19 pandemic, we can take advantage and make some movements towards more positive
social change
towards the homeless.
Gosh, it's such a multi-layered kind of conversation, but I guess I'm just going to start with the real immediate, harsh reality that in the capital region, a landlord association released a statistic that showed that only 50%, maybe 40% of people were able to make rent this last month. That statistic is usually more like 95%. And this is in the capital region, okay? Now, what is it looking like in New York City? Well, there was one trade association I saw that said that, the rent compliance rate was more like 95%. I don't believe that for a moment. I think there are a lot of people who are struggling to meet rent. And to just keep going farther, the governor has, extended the time by which people could not be evicted to August 20th. But in that order, he narrowed things quite a bit to people only who could demonstrate that they were affected by the COVID crisis. And then what happens at the end of this eviction period when people are looking at a fiscal cliff of 3-4 months back rent, which they couldn't possibly do, then that sends them into court, and God knows what's going to happen there. Then if you're undocumented, the last thing you want to do is be showing up in court to tangle with your landlord. You might get outed and picked up by ICE and this kind of thing. So we just really need massive assistance to help people cover their rent. In terms of homelessness, we're seeing just as the city, particularly New York City, is moving people into hotels, you have a lot more people showing up at the shelters. So just as you start to thin those out a little bit to protect people, you have demand, which is escalating. The city's making some progress, but there's some question as to whether it's really using the resources that they've already been given to put people into hotels. And then what do you do with people who were formerly incarcerated who are trying to find their way as well? So that's kind of a landscape. I'm not doing justice to this at all. But in the middle of that craziness, we're trying to think through the strategies of how churches with property can think about how they might build housing or acquire property to build housing. A huge percentage of the property in New York City is owned by faith-based institutions and nonprofits. And there's a lot of possibilities there. But it takes a lot of creativity and expertise, and that's what we try to do, to kind of help churches think about that.
You were making me feel real depressed with your first opening statement, and then you came up with something that sounds wonderful. I hope it could happen, and wonder if COVID-19 as a unique experience for humankind could wake us up to a new imagination. Brian, I wonder if you have any thoughts about this.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I mean, right now it's tough, with everyone settled at home. We're, fortunate. We've been donating to food banks and things, and as I mentioned, we're doing our postcarding from home. What I'm really hoping, though, is once this whole we come out of this, settle in place, I'm hoping this has been a wake-up call for people, and maybe they realize, we focus a lot on government in our justice team. Maybe they realize that, government's not bad. Safety net's important. We need to work on our medical system for all. But we've got a lot of work to do. And, budget justice, we need the funds to do the right thing and get these social policies going. So, we need to look for where we can come up with these funds and then put the funds to use in the right places.
Yeah, this whole thing is quite depressing. But there's good things that happen. Just today, they opened up West End Avenue, which we live right above, to foot traffic, so that and no cars, but just foot traffic, and so positive things happen.
Well, cars going 5 miles an hour.
5 miles an hour.
Yeah.
The idea of churches pushing their property towards helping people find homes. It sounds just amazing. And it reminds me of this idea of Jubilee Year, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, in which, every 50 years, people would redistribute the wealth so that, it's a natural kind of human nature that everything seems to go in one direction and then just redistribute it every 50 years. Peter, your idea sounds like something like that redistribution. Any thoughts on this idea? I know we're not going to have a Jubilee Year, but what about the feeling of a Jubilee Year? Peter, go ahead.
Well, I'm just pondering that. When I think of Jubilee years, I think of debt, and I think about the debt that so many people carry, overextended credit card debt because they were paying, 45, 50% of their income on rent or more, or student loan debt, or, heavy amounts of debt in New York City where housing costs are just so high. To offer people some relief in that way, or at least to introduce some living options for people so that they're not having to be so debt dependent to survive, seems like a very Jubilee kind of thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Alex, any ideas about this?
Yeah, I think everything that's been shared is 100% right. The thoughts that come to me specifically are, especially when we talk about the role of the church. One, if this crisis has or should remind us of anything, it's how interconnected we are. That when it comes to a pandemic, we are only as safe as our most vulnerable. And if you want to talk about why we need things like, affordable rent and paid sick time and Medicare for all and all of those pieces, it's because of this. And you hope that we can remember that. It's also drawn a really stark line to show which lives we really value and which we don't, right? The fact that thousands and thousands of people are being condemned to death in jail for nonviolent offenses because they're poor and Black and Latino. But the last thing is, especially in the Christian tradition, we of all people should understand the idea of Jubilee and resurrection, and how, if we believe in a God who can make a way out of no way. There's a really famous kind of teaching of praise God on the right side of the shore. Before you've gotten across the river, you praise God because God has figured that out. That the idea of rebirth into something better is where the church should have such a vital role to play in saying, how can we, from this moment and this tragedy, bring about something better, not go back to normal. I'm really tired of people saying that, because if you thought normal was good, you're not paying attention. But how can we be a resurrection people? And that's where I think we have some huge challenge, but the really opportunity and the work that the church has to do.
It's the work our political leaders have to do also. We all have to work towards that resurrection.
Brian, any last words? What do you think about all this?
Justice is important. The more we can get people involved, the better. I think the focus on the political is really, really important. We've talked about how that's part of it. One thing I realized when I was at the Doe Fund, there were just so many people. And I realized the politicians can change things with the stroke of a pen. No amount of volunteering, no amount of giving can overcome bad policy. And the politicians are the ones that control, to a large extent, the policies. So we have to get involved and make that work.
The fact that we don't have any policy right now from our leadership indicates the enormous need for policy, the absence, the vacuum of policy. We need a government and leadership that can see us into the future. I pray that we have
need a path.
We need a path. We need a path, and we need leadership.
We have no idea. Just on an anecdotal basis, I want to get and be with my grandson, but I have no idea. This is a bad example, I guess, but it's just what's affecting us, and we don't know what's the right thing to do.
We have lost Brian, and I think maybe we have to thank you
done,
for this enticing and interesting
you can
conversation.
Cut that last bit out. It was too personal.
I was going to say, no, that you got to keep that comment you just made. So
thank you very much. I'll say thank you to Brian, who got kicked off here, and Alex and Peter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Great.
And really good luck with your work.
This is Bar Crawl Radio. Alina Larson, Alan Winson, and I, Rebecca McCain, want to thank the Reverend Peter Cook, Brian Kramer, and Alex Tendell Wiesendunger for joining us today, and congratulations to Alex on the publication of his books, Seeds of Justice. Again, these are the sounds of the Upper West Side. Every evening at 7 p.m., across from where we are recording this BCR episode on West End Avenue, a middle-aged man beats a great white plastic bucket with a wooden spoon, and our neighbors rally in a 5-minute riotous cheer for the medical workers and other essential workers of our embattled city. We thank you for your service and wish you a safe voyage through these dangerous waters.
If you like what you hear, please contact us at barcrawradio@gmail.com. And everyone, be safe.